So I just want to start off with the most important stuff. There'll be 3 collections tonight, and hi everybody and welcome. I'm John Ooney, Father John Ooney, the pastor here at St. Cecilia, and I just want to welcome everybody who has come to be with us from near and far this evening. It's been much anticipated, at least on my behalf, and I know really on all of our behalf. We'd like to welcome back to St. Cecilia Father Jim Martin. He was back here in April, and he spoke about his book, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, and he took us on a great journey, a great pilgrimage with him. And tonight it's kind of a groundbreaking, I think, on some level, special night where Jim decided to launch his newest book, Building a Bridge, and it's about that conversation between the LGBT community and the institutional church, you know, and based on all the important things that I hope we have tried to wrestle with and be about here at St. Cecilia, and I'm imagining all of us have tried to be this way, and we're looking for a way to go forward. And this guy is so articulate, he's so smart, he's wicked smart. And he's funny, and he's just, I think, a gift to the church and a gift to all of us this evening. So tonight's scope will be that we start 10 minutes late, like we do normally here at St. Cecilia. And Father Jim will speak after I introduce Rosaria, and then we'll have a response to Jim's talk with 2 of our beautiful friends and parishioners, Maggie Giles and Dr. Andy Lawton. So we're just so grateful that you guys are here with us tonight, and just grateful. And then the questions that folks have come up with, and then any that kind of come up during the evening, please feel free. We won't be able to get to every single one of them, but it'll give us, I think, some great discussion afterwards. And we'll have you out of here by midnight, and I think it'll all just be really beautiful. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Rosaria Solano. Rosaria is on our wonderful Adult Faith Formation Committee. So why don't you come on.
I warned him within an inch of his life. He had to do that. No, I didn't. So I'm going to say welcome to St. Cecilia's. And we are delighted to have so many friends with us tonight, both folks who are here all the time and some of you who are here maybe for the first time. Father Martin is no stranger to our community. In fact, he was here in April, as John just said, to talk to us about Jesus. And tonight he is here in a very, very exploratory way, and we're really excited to have him. As we said on that evening when he was in April, before Pope Francis became Pope, Father Martin was perhaps the best known and best loved Jesuit in the United States. And now he's just number 2. Father Martin is a Jesuit, editor-at-large of America Magazine, and best-selling author of Jesus, a Pilgrimage, My Life with the Saints, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, and Between Heaven and Mirth. In addition to being a prolific author, Father Martin knows how to tell a good joke. He has written many publications, including in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and he is a regular commentator in both the national and international media. He has appeared on all major radio and television networks, as well as in the venues ranging from NPR's Fresh Air and PBS's NewsHour to Comedy Central's The Colbert Report. Before entering the Jesuits in 1988, Father Martin graduated from the Wharton School of Business and worked for General Electric for 6 years. On April 1st of this year, Pope Francis appointed Father Martin as a consultant to the Vatican Secretariat for Communications. The Secretariat is responsible for the Vatican Radio and the Vatican Television Center, as well as the Holy See's website and the Pope's Twitter handle at Pontifex. Tonight's topic is one that is important to so many of the members of this community, as well as of the wider church. Bishop McElroy, the Bishop of San Diego, said, "The gospel demands that LGBT Catholics must be genuinely loved and treasured in the life of the church. They are not. In building a bridge, Father Martin provides us with the language, perspective, and sense of urgency to replace a culture of alienation with a culture of merciful inclusion." At the conclusion of Father Martin's presentation, copies of the Building a Bridge will be sold downstairs in our parish hall, and Father Martin will remain here to sign copies, and he does sign every copy of a person waiting in line. So if you're wanting to do that, he will take care of you. So we hope you'll come down to meet Father Martin and to have some light refreshments. We also have sign-up sheets both in the narthex and downstairs for those of you who would like to be a part of the St. Cecilia Faith Formation mailing list. And there are also baskets located around the narthex and the parish hall for donations. I know many of you have already made donations, and we thank you for them, but just in case, you'll find a basket. And some of you have cards for questions. Scott and Cole will collect them. And now, without further delay, it is my great privilege to introduce Father James Martin.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back here. I want to start off with thanks and a little disclaimer. So the thanks to Father John Uni, the wonderful pastor here, also to the Rainbow Ministry, along with Father John hosted me for dinner, the pastoral staff here. So I want to say thank you for your welcome. I wanted to launch this book in Boston here. There's also three guys that I'd like to recognize. I'm going to embarrass them. I want to also establish some bona fides with people. I am a New England province Jesuit. I did my formation largely in New England. We're now called the Northeast Province, but I entered the Jesuits, and our novitiate was in Jamaica Plain. And I've done many retreats at Eastern Point in Gloucester and Campion Center in Weston, and I studied at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology. So I feel that, I'm not saying this just to butter you up, but feel buttered if you want to, that really Boston is my spiritual home. I was also a devotee of the Jesuit Urban Center, and with us tonight are, And I'm going to ask them to stand with us tonight are Fathers John Spencer and Jim Shaughnessy and Rick DeShays. Can you stand and just be recognized? Yeah, where are you? There they are, they're in the back. Like all Jesuits, they are humble and self-effacing. I do want to tell one joke, I can't resist. So a Jesuit, a Dominican, and a Franciscan are they go to this place and they eat. They go to Durgan Park and they eat and they get food poisoning and they die. And yeah, I know, I had to pick some place. And so God the Father looks down at them from his great golden throne and he says, "Son of St. Francis, what do you believe?" And the Franciscan says, "I believe that by serving the poor, I was serving you." And God says, "Good answer, come into heaven." And he looks at the Dominican and he says, "Son of St. Dominic, what do you believe?" And he says, "I believe that by studying theology and preaching, I was serving you." And God says, "Good answer, son of St. Dominic, welcome to heaven." And from his big golden throne, God looks at the Jesuit and says, "Son of St. Ignatius, what do you believe?" And the Jesuit says, "I believe you're in my seat." Which is a true story. So the disclaimer is that this book, Building a Bridge, which makes the perfect gift for your friends and family, is, I would say, my first foray into kind of I've written a lot about it, and I've done sort of informal ministry with LGBT people, but it is my first sort of formal foray in terms of publishing into this ministry. And so my disclaimer and my apology is that if I don't use the right language or the right terminology, or if it seems like I'm leaving somebody out, it's because of my ignorance, I would say, and my lack of experience. I don't do this ministry full time, basically. So with that said, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about building a bridge. Building a bridge. The relationship between and by the way, this talk may not have as many jokes as one would hope. The relationship between the LGBT Catholic community and the Catholic Church in this country has been at times contentious and combative, and at times warm and welcoming. Much of the tension in this complicated relationship results from a lack of communication. By the way, speaking of which, afterwards we're going to have some responses, because Father John and I decided that rather than me just talking at you, it would be nice to have someone from the community kind of respond to what I'm saying. So we have two wonderful guests. So it results, I think, from a lack of communication and a good deal of mistrust between LGBT Catholics and the hierarchy. What is needed, I think, is a bridge between that community, the LGBT community, or LGBTQIA, whatever acronym you prefer, and the institutional church. So I'd like to invite you to think about that bridge tonight. To that end, we need to reflect on both the church's outreach to the LGBT community and the LGBT community's outreach to the institutional church, because good bridges take people in both directions. The Catechism, as you know, invites us to treat LGBT people, it uses the term homosexual persons, but we can expand that, with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Three great words. Now, what would that mean? What would it mean for the church to treat the LGBT community with respect, compassion, and sensitivity? And what would it mean for the LGBT community, something we don't often think about, to treat the church in that way too? And by the way, when I refer to the church, I mean the institutional church. So that means the Vatican, the hierarchy, church officials, the clergy, but also lay pastoral workers, any official member of the church. So in this talk tonight, I'd like to take a walk on the first lane of that bridge. It's a two-way bridge. The first lane, which is the one leading from the institutional church to the LGBT community. And I'd like to reflect on what it might mean for our church to treat our LGBT community with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Now, there's the other lane from the LGBT community to the church, but I'll leave you to read that in the book, which makes the perfect gift for your friends and family. It's very small, too. Respect. First of all, respect means, at the very least, recognizing that the LGBT community exists. Extending to it the recognition that any community deserves because of its presence among us. Last year, a week ago last week, after the mass shootings at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, while some bishops, some Catholic bishops, expressed their support for the LGBT community, most of them said nothing, and fewer still mentioned the words LGBT or gay. To me, that revealed a kind of failure to acknowledge even the existence of that community. But this is not a Christian model, for Jesus recognizes all people, even those who are invisible at times in the community. Jesus reaches out specifically to those on the margins. Catholics, therefore, have a responsibility to make everyone feel visible and valuable. Recognizing that LGBT Catholics exist as part of respect has important pastoral implications. It means carrying out ministries that some parishes, like St. Cecilia's, do very well. Examples, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you're a parishioner, would be LGBT masses, sponsoring diocesan and parish outreach programs like Rainbow, and helping LGBT Catholics feel that they are part of the church, that they are welcomed and they are loved. Now, some Catholics object to this, saying that any outreach implies a kind of tacit agreement with everything that anyone in the LGBT community says or does. But I think that is a completely unfair objection because it is raised with no other group. LGBT people, I feel, are put under a microscope. If a diocese sponsors an outreach program for, say, Catholic business leaders, it does not mean that the Catholic Church has sanctified everything that every businessman or businesswoman ever says or does. No one suggests that. It doesn't mean that the Catholic Church sanctifies the corporate way of doing things or everything that corporate America does. No one suggests that. Why not? Because people already understand that the diocese is trying to help a particular group feel more connected to their church, the church that they belong to by virtue of their baptism. This is what outreach programs for LGBT Catholics do. Second, excuse me, respect means calling a group what it asks to be called. On a personal level, if someone says to you, please call me Jim instead of James, you would naturally listen and call the person by the name that he or she prefers. That's just common courtesy. You know, so you kept calling me Jimmy, you know, which only my family does and friends from way back when, I'd be like, what's going on here? You know, it's just common courtesy. God bless you. It's the same on a group level. We don't say, for example, Negroes any longer, as far as I know. Why? Because that group feels more comfortable with other names like African American or blacks. Recently I was told that disabled persons, I was corrected, is not as acceptable as people with disabilities. So now I'll use the latter term. I mean, it's easy enough for me to use another term. It is respectful to call people by the name they choose. Everyone has a right to name themselves. This is not, it seems like it might be a minor concern for our faith tradition, but it is not. In the Jewish and Christian traditions, names are important. A name in the Hebrew Scriptures stands for a person identity. Knowing a person's name meant, in a sense, that you knew that person, that you had a kind of intimate relationship with him or her, and in fact, you had a kind of power over them. Pardon me. That's one reason why when Moses asks God what God's name is, God says, I am who I am. In other words, none of your damn business. Right? Because Moses is not going to have power over God by knowing the name. Names are very important. In the New Testament, Jesus renames Simon as Peter. The persecutor Saul renames himself as Paul. Names are important in our church as well. If you've been to baptism lately, the very first thing that the priest or deacon asks is, what name do you give this child? So very important. And because names are important, church leaders are invited to be attentive to how they name the LGBT community and LGBT people. So let us finally lay to rest phrases like afflicted with same-sex affliction. No, which is used, which no LGBT person I know uses, and even homosexual person, which can seem overly clinical. You know, if you go online, I just posted an article a couple hours ago responding to people who insist that you must use same-sex attraction. Why? Because using LGBT supposedly is degrading and only identifies a person by their sexual identity. And my response is, well, how the hell is same-sex attraction any different from that? You know, so let's listen. I'm not prescribing what term to use, by the way. I know that's debatable too. The point is, let's listen to what our LGBT companions and friends prefer to name themselves. And frankly, if Pope Francis can use the word gay, so can the rest of the church. Respect also means acknowledging that LGBT Catholics bring unique gifts to the church, both as individuals and as community. These gifts build up the church in special ways. As St. Paul wrote when he compared the people of God to a human body, every body part is important. The hand, the eye, the foot. Just consider the gifts brought by LGBT Catholics who work in parishes, schools, chanceries, retreat centers, hospitals, social service agencies. Oh, thanks. So I'm like the Samaritan woman. Thank you. I love that story. That's an important story for us to think about, too. As one example, someone criticized me for this. I've been getting a lot of critiques, which is good. It's healthy. I feel free because I just say, I start the conversation. I use this example and someone said, that's a stereotype. But in my experience, some of the most gifted music ministers I've known in my 30 years as a Jesuit have been gay men who have brought tremendous joy to their parishes. Maybe that's a stereotype, but in my experience, a lot of the music ministers I've known have been gay. They themselves are among the most joyful people I've ever known in the Catholic Church. Period. The Church is invited to meditate also in a community how LGBT Catholics build up the Church with their presence. And although it is wrong to generalize, we can still pose the question, what might those gifts be? What does the LGBT community bring? Well, many LGBT people have endured from an early age misunderstanding, prejudice, hatred, persecution, even violence. And therefore, in my experience, often have a natural compassion for the marginalized. Their compassion is a gift. They have often been made to feel unwelcome in their parishes and in their churches. But they persevere because of their faith. Perseverance is a gift. They are often very forgiving of clergy who have treated them like dirt. Let me tell you, just a couple weeks ago, I got a message through my public Facebook page from a woman who said, Father, do you know any compassionate priests in the Phoenix area? I get all these messages like this. They break my heart. Because I'm working in a hospice, and the priest assigned to the hospice will not anoint this man who's dying because he's gay. So, these stories, which I'm sure you've heard many more of, mean that oftentimes LGBT people, yeah, that's an outrage, are forgiving of the Church. Forgiveness is a gift that they bring. Compassion, perseverance, and forgiveness from the community itself are gifts that they bring to the Church. Seeing, naming, and honoring all these gifts are components of respecting our LGBT brothers and sisters. So as accepting them as beloved children of God and letting them know that they are beloved children of God. Not just a tacit acceptance, but we love you. The Church has a call to proclaim God's love for people who have often been made to feel, whether by their families or neighbors or religious leader, as though they were damaged goods, unworthy of ministry, or even subhuman. Respect should also be extended to the workplace, especially if that workplace is a church or a church-related organization. To that end, I'm very concerned and saddened by the recent spate of firings. I think it's been over 100 people, that was the tally, of LGBT men and women. Now, I'll lay out my way of looking at this, which, you can disagree with. Church organizations have the authority to require their employees to follow church teachings. That's part of being, if I work at America Magazine, if I came in and spat on the floor every day, people would say that we don't do that here. The problem is that this authority is applied in a very highly selective way. Almost all the firings in recent years have focused on LGBT matters. Specifically, the firings have usually related to those employees who have entered into same-sex marriages, which is against church teaching, and when one or the other partner has a public role in the church. But if adherence to church teaching is going to be a litmus test for employment in Catholic institutions, then dioceses and parishes should be consistent. So, think about this. Do we fire people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment? Do we fire women who bear children out of wedlock? Do we fire people who are living together without being married? Do we fire people who practice birth control? Those actions are all against church teaching. What about employees who are not Catholic? Think about this. If adherence to church teaching is the requirement for employment in a church organization, do we fire Protestants who work in Catholic organizations because they don't believe in papal authority? That's a pretty important church teaching. Do we fire, here we are in Boston, Unitarians who don't believe in the Trinity? That's an important church teaching. Do we fire people for these things? We do not. Why not? Because we are selective in terms of which church teachings matter. Here's another way of looking at this kind of selectivity. Another reason why it's problematic. Now, you may roll your eyes or laugh, but requiring church employees to follow church teaching means at a more fundamental level adhering to the gospel. So, do we fire people for not helping the poor? Do we fire people for not being forgiving? Do we fire people for being mean? Do we fire people for being cruel? Do we fire people for being not loving? Do we fire people who do not take care of the environment? Remember, Laudato Si is an encyclical. It may seem odd to you to hear these questions, but why should it? These teachings that I'm talking about, helping the poor, being loving, forgiving, are the most essential of church teachings. So the selectivity of focus on LGBT matters when it comes to firing is, to use the words of the Catechism, a sign of unjust discrimination, something we are to avoid. Compassion. What would it mean for the institutional church to show compassion to LGBT people? Now, the word compassion from the Greek pascho means to experience or suffer with. So that's where the passion comes from. What would it mean for the institutional church not only to respect LGBT Catholics, but to be with them, to experience life with them, even to suffer with them? This question can be asked not only about the hierarchy, but the whole church. Not only bishops and priests, but pastor workers, DREs, teachers, administrators, as well as parishioners. How can all of us experience and suffer with our LGBT brothers and sisters? The first and most essential requirement, in my opinion, is listening. It's impossible to experience a person's life or be compassionate if you don't listen to the person, if you don't ask questions, if you don't know the person. If all you're doing is issuing statements or preaching about them or tweeting about them or condemning them, how is that in any way listening? So it sounds so elementary and banal, but here are questions that Catholic leaders might ask their LGBT brothers and sisters. What's your life like? What was it like growing up as a gay boy in the church? What was it like growing up as a lesbian girl? What's it like being transgender? How have you suffered as a result of your orientation or your identity? Where do you experience joy in your life? What makes you happy? What's your experience of God? Who's God for you? Who's Jesus for you? What is your experience of the church? They might also ask the parents and family members of LGBT Catholics these kinds of questions. Because one of the things I've realized just in the last few months, since this book was announced, people ask questions and people ask questions at the Jesus Talk. As my David Donovan, my first spiritual director, was a Bostonian, used to say when something, maybe this is an expression here, I only heard it from him, when I would get something that was obvious, he would say, "Oh yes, dawn breaks on Marblehead." So a few months ago, I was at Yale at the Catholic Center there, the St. Thomas More Center, and this elderly woman came up to me at a book signing afterwards, and she looked like she was at a central casting for grandmothers. Now, I've said this and grandmothers have gotten mad at me, so I apologize. Maybe that'll be my next book. And she leaned over and she said, Father Martin, it was about Jesus, and I thought she was going to say, I've been to the Holy Land, or Teresa of Lisieux is my favorite saint. You know what she said? She's probably late 70s. My grandchild is transgender, and I love her so much, and I just want her to feel part of the church. And I thought, my gosh, this ministry is not just for this sort of rather narrow swath of people, it's to her. It's to families and parents and grandparents and friends. So ministry at LGBT Catholics is ministry to all who love them. For the church to exercise compassion, we need to listen to all these people. And when we listen, we will hear the calls for help and prayer. When our LGBT brothers and sisters are persecuted, church leaders are invited to stand with them. In many parts of the world, LGBT people are liable to experience, as you know, appalling incidents of prejudice, violence, and even murder. As you know, you can be executed in some countries for being gay or being a gay leader. In those countries, the Catholic Church has an absolute moral duty to stand up for its brothers and sisters publicly. Sadly, as you know, this does not happen very often. And in fact, some church leaders have supported some of these discriminatory laws or have remained silent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. That's not the only place. But embedded in Catholic teaching is already a call to stand with our LGBT brothers and sisters, not simply the Gospels and things like the parable of the Good Samaritan, someone who's beaten by the side of the road, but the Catechism, which says that every sign of unjust discrimination must be avoided. Closer to home, what would it mean for the church in the U.S. to say, when needed, it is wrong to treat LGBT people like this? Catholic leaders regularly publish statements, as they should, defending the unborn, refugees and migrants, the poor, the homeless, the aged. They should do that. This is one way to stand with people, to put yourself out there, as the bishops are doing very well right now with health care. The U.S. bishops are doing very good in terms of raising their voices and for migrants and refugees. But where are the statements in support of our LGBT brothers and sisters? Now, when I ask this, the reflexive response is, you cannot compare what refugees face with what LGBT people face. As someone who worked in Africa for 2 years with refugees, I know that that's often the case. But it is also important not to ignore the disproportionately high rates of suicide among LGBT youths. That's a life issue, by the way. And the fact that LGBT people are victims of proportionally more hate crimes than any other minority group in the country. Bullying of LGBT students in schools is also an evil that should be opposed, particularly given the Catholic Church's long history and extensive experience with running schools. As I mentioned before, in the wake of the massacres last year, when the LGBT community in this country was grieving, I was discouraged that more bishops did not signal their support. Some did. Cardinal Tobin, Cardinal Supich, Bishop Stowe, Bishop McElroy. Some did, very, very strongly. The Bishop of St. Petersburg, Lynch. But imagine if the attacks were on, God forbid, a Methodist parish, just to pick a denomination. You know that every bishop would say, we stand today with our Methodist brothers and sisters. They would go to a Methodist church, they would celebrate a prayer service, they would have Methodist pastors in their churches. Why didn't more Catholics name our LGBT brothers and sisters in Orlando? Why could they not even mention the words gay or LGBT? To me, it seemed a failure of compassion, a failure to experience with, a failure to suffer with, a failure, it just dawns on me, what Jim Keenan, my professor of moral theology, used to call the greatest sin for Jesus, a failure to bother. For Jesus, sin was often a failure to bother. Not people who were weak and trying, as Jim would like to say, but who were strong and failed to bother. So, we don't need to look far for a model for this. God does all this for us in Jesus. Stands with and experiences with us. The first line of the Gospel of John is, the Word became flesh and lived among us. The Greek is really great, and it's probably better translated as, the Word became flesh and pitched its tent among us. Isn't that great? He was in our camp. This is what Jesus did. Lived alongside us, took our side, and died like us. This is what the church is called to do with all marginalized groups, as Pope Francis always reminds us, including LGBT Catholics, to experience their lives and suffer with them. And as one gay man who... You doing okay? Can you hear me okay? There we go. As one gay man reminded me, and I changed this, to rejoice with them too. He read my book and he said, it's not all about suffering, Jim, because Jesus came to experience all parts of our lives. I always remind people, you're going to laugh, but this is true. Jesus' first miracle was to make more alcohol at a party. Right? You laugh, that's what he did in abundance. So can you rejoice with our LGBT brothers and sisters in their gifts and their talents and their enthusiasm? Can we celebrate not just their gifts, but them? That's a kind of compassion too, experiencing with compassion. Finally, sensitivity. How can the institutional church be sensitive? This is again in the Catechism, towards LGBT people. Merriam-Webster's defines sensitivity as an awareness or understanding of the feelings of other people. That's beautiful. That's related to Pope Francis's call for the church to be one of encounter and accompaniment. To begin with, it is impossible to know another person's feelings at a distance. You cannot understand the feelings of an individual or a community if you don't know the individual or the community. One reason I believe that the institutional church has struggled with sensitivity is that many church leaders still do not know many gay and lesbian people. And let me just back up for a second. One of the reasons I felt called to write this book was that I've been a Jesuit for almost 30 years, which is unbelievable to me, and I know a lot of bishops and archbishops and cardinals, and priests, obviously. I know a lot of priests and sisters and brothers and deacons and lay Catholics, but I know a lot of bishops and archbishops and cardinals. Some of them are friends of mine, right? All of them have been kind to me and generous to me, right? The ones I've talked to about this issue want to reach out. They're sincere. I also know, obviously, a lot of LGBT people who come to me for all sorts of things, ministry and spiritual direction and counseling. But my experience is that many church leaders do not know LGBT people. Now, the temptation is to smile and say, oh, they do know, gay priests or bishops who are now public about their homosexuality. But my point is a larger point. They don't know them on a personal level. That lack of familiarity and friendship means that it is more difficult to be sensitive. So one invitation is for the hierarchy, this is so basic, to get to know LGBT people as their friends. Not as objects of preaching, not as people who are defined just by an act, because they are much more than that, but as friends. In 2015, Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, umlaut, Archbishop of Vienna, reminded us of this at the meeting of the Synod of Bishops on the Family. You remember that, the synod that happened. Around that time, what happened was it was on the family, but because Pope Francis, really believes that the Holy Spirit is at work in the people of God, and the bishops asked for questionnaires, and so things came up, and a lot of stuff about sexuality came up, not surprisingly. Cardinal Schönborn said that he knew a gay couple who had transformed his understanding of LGBT people. He even offered qualified praise for same-sex unions. Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna, quote, this is about his friend, "One shares one's life. One shares the joys and sufferings. One helps one another. We must recognize that this person, his friend, has made an important step for his own good and for the good of others, even though this is not a situation the Church considers regular." Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna, 2 years ago. He also overruled a priest in his archdiocese who had prohibited a man in a same-sex union from serving on a parish council. Cardinal Schönborn stood with his LGBT brother. Much of this came from his experience, he said, of his friendship with LGBT people. Cardinal Schönborn said of the Church, quote, "It must accompany people." In this, as in all things, Jesus is our model. When Jesus encountered people on the margins, he saw not categories, but individuals. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the LGBT community should be or should feel marginalized. Rather, I'm saying that many of them do find themselves and do feel marginalized. They are seen as the other. But for Jesus, there is no other. And I want to just briefly talk about two of my favorite stories. At one point in the Gospels, Jesus meets a Roman centurion asking for healing for his servant. In Capernaum, remember him? Be nice to him, they say, because he built our synagogue for us, say the Jewish people of Capernaum. Now, although the man is not Jewish, Jesus saw a man in need and responded to his need. Now, by the way, I didn't put this in the book, but there is some debate. I didn't put it in the book because it is very controversial and controverted. The word that is used, I think it's paideia, or another Greek word, makes some scripture scholars believe that that servant was actually the centurion's lover. Okay, now, I don't know. I don't know, because I'm not a scripture scholar. But that is several reputable people have said that. Later in Luke's gospel, Jesus meets Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector in Jericho. Remember Zacchaeus, who's described as short in stature? He climbs a sycamore tree because he wanted to see who Jesus was. When Jesus sees Zacchaeus perched in the tree, he saw a person seeking to encounter him. And even though the tax collector was considered the chief sinner in the area, chief tax collector means chief sinner, Jesus invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. What happens in that story? So Jesus is walking through Jericho. Now imagine, I think Zacchaeus is such an important story for us. Imagine Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, who feels probably on the outs with every Jewish person in that city. He goes up a tree to see who Jesus was. How like LGBT people that is, who just try hard to see who Jesus was. But he is prevented, says the Gospel of Luke, by the crowd. He cannot see Jesus because of the crowd. How often is the crowd in our church preventing us from seeing Jesus? Zacchaeus literally goes out on a limb for Jesus, right? Jesus passes by. What would you expect Jesus to do? Now, some church leaders would say, sinner, 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 worst sinner of all, chief sinner. Jesus says, come down from that tree. Tonight I must stay at your house. A public sign of welcome. Now, I'm not saying that LGBT people should be considered sinners, but this is a man who feels on the outskirts of society. That's the point. Others considered him as beyond the pale. And you know what the gospel says in Luke? And the people grumbled. They didn't like that. They didn't like that Jesus was talking to someone that they didn't care for. And the Greek is stasis. Zacchaeus stood his ground. And he says, anything I have defrauded, I will repay these people 4 times over. It's community first for Jesus. And then whatever conversion has to happen, and we're all called to conversion, happens later. The movement for Jesus is always from the outside in. From the outside in. And he also, by the way, brings his disciples from the inside out, moving them towards the margins, the peripheries. He's speaking to people, healing them, offering them what scholars call table fellowship, dining with them. He's critiqued for this, but he's about creating a sense of us. You know, because for Jesus, there's no us and them, there's just us. That's it for Jesus. There's no us and them. Now, one common objection, which I hear all the time, is Jesus, no. Jesus told them not to sin first. We cannot meet LGBT people because they are sinful, goes the argument. And when we do meet them, the very first thing we have to say is stop sinning. But more often than not, this is not Jesus' way. Sorry. In the story of the Roman centurion, he does not say pagan. He's a Roman centurion. Pagan, get out. You know what he says? You remember the story that the centurion comes up and he says, my servant is sick, and Jesus says, I'll come to your house. You don't need to come to my house. I'm a man under authority too. I say to someone, go, and he goes. I say to another, do this, and he does it. And Jesus is amazed and says, nowhere in Israel have I seen such faith. And he heals the guy. No word of him being pagan, sinner. He does the same with Zacchaeus. For Jesus, it is more often than not community first. Meeting, encountering, including, loving, and any conversion second. By the way, this comes from the scripture scholar Ben Myers, who contrasted this with John the Baptist's approach, which is conversion first, right? Repentance and baptism, and then entrance into the community. Not for Jesus, more often than not. Sensitivity, therefore, is based on encounter, accompaniment, and friendship. Now, where does all this lead? To the second meaning of sensitivity, which is in common parlance a heightened awareness for what might offend. When we are sensitive to people, we are also sensitive to anything that might offend. You know, you're a sensitive person. One way to be sensitive is to consider the language we use. Some bishops, several bishops, have already called for the church to set aside the phrase objectively disordered when it comes to describing the homosexual inclination as it is in the Catechism. The phrase, as you know, relates to the orientation, not the person, but it is still needlessly hurtful. Setting aside such language was discussed at the Synod on the Family. This was discussed by the bishops. So it's in the air. This is not just Jim Martin. An Italian theologian told me that perhaps a better word was, and you may disagree with this, but it's interesting, differently ordered. It's different. Part of sensitivity is understanding all that. Now, in my book, I also invite the LGBT community to treat the institutional church with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. And very briefly, respect, actually respecting the bishops, listening to them, not mocking them, not putting up funny pictures that you think make them look effeminate, because frankly, that just perpetuates this cycle of hatred. Respecting them, actually, as individuals, right? Compassion. Thinking about them in the complexity of their ministries, not just their triple ministry of teach, govern, and sanctify, but all the things that they imagine, who's a friend of mine that I admire, imagine all the stuff that Cardinal O'Malley has to do. Think about clustering parishes, right? Dealing with the fallout from the sex abuse crisis, raising money, helping to run schools, fielding complaints, dealing with priest personnel, dealing with religious orders. I mean, endless. So to see them in the complexity of their mission and the complexity of their ministry is a kind of compassion. And sensitivity is also understanding at what level of authority they're speaking. Being sensitive to that. So it's a two-way bridge. But for me, the onus really here is on the institutional church, because it is the LGBT community that has been marginalized by the church and not the other way around, as far as I can see it. Overall, the invitation is for both the institutional church, bishops, Vatican, hierarchy, priests, people who work in an official capacity, to treat the LGBT community with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, and vice versa, onto this bridge of mutual respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Now, I know that even that small part at the end may be hard for the LGBT community to hear. And I know that some of this may be challenging for bishops to hear. I wrote an article today that I was saying that I told my editor, I said, I know exactly what the critique's going to be. From many LGBT people, it's going to be, you're not going far enough. And for the bishops, it's going to be, you're going way too far. So I thought, well, I'm probably in the right place. Because it's bringing people together. It's standing in the middle and bringing people together and saying, come on, come up, take a step. And it's going to be hard because neither lane on that bridge is smooth. On this bridge, as in life, there are tolls, right? It costs when you live a life of respect, compassion, and sensitivity. But to trust in that bridge is to trust that eventually people, Catholics, will be able to cross back and forth easily, that the hierarchy in the LGBT community will be able to encounter one another, to accompany one another, to love one another. It is to trust that God desires unity, that they may be one, right? We pray for Christian unity, you know? That's just not with, Episcopalians and Methodists and Presbyterians. It's within our church. And we are all on the bridge together. Because that bridge, of course, is the church. In conclusion, I'd like to say something to the LGBT Catholics here, specifically. In difficult times, which I know you have lived through, just looking at some of the faces out there and seeing, you're as old as I am or older than I am, I know that you have lived through. You might say, what keeps that bridge standing? What keeps that bridge from collapsing onto the sharp rocks? What keeps me from plunging into the dangerous waters below? And I'll tell you, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is supporting the church, and it is supporting you. Because you are beloved children of God, who by virtue of your baptism have as much place in this church as Pope Francis, Cardinal O'Malley, Father John Uni, or me. which, really, I hope is obvious. I always tell LGBT Catholics, I feel like they're pushing me out of the church. I say, don't let people, it's your church. Show me your damn baptism certificate, I mean, really, Jesus Christ himself called you into the church on the day of your baptism. Just remember that and hold on to that. And I really think that there's something going on in the church right now. There's a real kairos moment going on in the church. Something shifted. You read, I'm sure, about Cardinal Joseph Tobin, the Archbishop of Newark, who had a welcome mass for LGBT Catholics. So what happened was this group of two parishes, two LGBT ministries decided, which frankly I thought, okay, they wanted to do an LGBT pilgrimage to the Cathedral in Newark. Thought, okay, that's interesting. And they wrote to Cardinal Tobin, and I was at a talk in Hoboken, and this couple told me about this talk, and they said that Cardinal Tobin had welcomed them. And I said, this is just over dinner, and I said, that's amazing. I wonder if that'll ever get out. Well, the next day, one of his priests wrote an article about how Cardinal Tobin said, you are very welcome in my cathedral, okay? And then, as you probably saw in the New York Times, he came and he stood at the door of the cathedral and welcomed people and then welcomed them at the beginning. That's one thing. You have Pope Francis talking about, who am I to judge? Which, by the way, someone tried to box him in the corner and say, well, you were just talking about gay priests. And he said, no, I was talking about all gay people, He met about a year ago when he was in the United States with his friend Yayo Grassi. Remember that guy who was his former student, and his partner. So I was at this New Ways Ministry talk. I was giving a New Ways Ministry talk from which this book sort of flows. And there was some Q&A at the end, which I enjoy. And this guy got up and said, this is a long story, he gets up and says, why does the Pope use the word condition? That's so rude, And so this other guy gets up and says, well, actually, the word condizione in Italian doesn't mean a condition like a medical condition. It means like a situation, condizione. And he says, and my friend Pope Francis, and I look over and it's this guy, Yayo Grassi. So I give him the microphone, and and he says, you know what the Pope said to me? This is his student. He said, not just who am I to judge, but who are we to judge? And the Pope said to me, homophobia has no place in my ministry. Okay? So something's happening. The Holy Spirit is doing something. Now, on that bridge, there's going to be some loose stones, some big bumps, and some deep potholes, because people in our church are not perfect by a long shot. We never have been. Just ask St. Peter, right? And we never will be. We never will be. We're all imperfect people struggling to do our best in the light of our individual vocations. We're all pilgrims along the way, loved sinners, as we Jesuits like to say, following the call we first heard from Jesus at our baptisms, and that we continue to hear every day of our lives. So I want to say to my LGBT brothers and sisters, you are not alone. Millions of your Catholic brothers and sisters accompany you, as do many of your bishops and archbishops and cardinals, as we journey imperfectly together along this bridge. More important, you are accompanied by God, the reconciler of all people of goodwill, as well as the architect, the builder, and the foundation of that bridge. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. What a wise guy. Man, Thank you, thank you, thank you. Listen, folks, if you've come up with some questions, obviously we're not going to be able to answer them all, but maybe if they can kind of funnel toward the middle aisle, please, and then we'll pick them up, and we can kind of get to some of those. And as that's happening, I would like to invite the wonderful Maggie Giles to come up and give a response. Maggie?
Well, thank you so much, Father Martin. It is such an incredible privilege to be invited to be part of this conversation this evening with you, with Father Uni, with all of St. Cecilia and our guests here this evening. I had the great privilege of reading Father Martin's book prior to tonight, and one of the things that most stood out for me is that I love the language that Father Martin provides us, from building a bridge to the concepts of respect and compassion and sensitivity throughout. Those are not only the building blocks of this conversation, of building the bridge, but it's also the conversation of the starting place of any healthy relationship. And really, when I think about this process that we're all engaged in, I think it all comes down to building the relationship building process, to encountering one another most authentically out from the shadows. I love the image of building the bridge, and I hope that here at St. Cecilia, as we rise to that challenge of building and of being that bridge for one another. In his book, Father Martin talks about respect as starting with the acknowledgement that we exist. And throughout the book, Father Martin provides a number of wonderful anecdotes to illustrate some of his writing, many of whom are examples from men. And so I wanted to just take a couple minutes this evening and share a little bit of my perspective, just as a little bit of balance, a little bit of my story. And I'll give you a little spoiler alert. The theme, the title could be Love Saves the Day. And I'm sharing it this evening just in case it resonates with anybody here in such a way that you might feel more invited into this conversation that is unfolding here this evening. So the timing of this evening's event is really remarkable for me personally. And again, I share it in case this resonates for anybody here this evening. The relationship building that Father Martin describes in his book is one going on in my life right now. I talk about how I am currently in the process of coming out, but I'm not talking about coming out as gay. I did that about 25 years ago, and that process was pretty smooth and fairly drama-free. I'm talking about the process of coming out as Catholic to my largely LGBT community and friends. And whether I'm talking about my relatives in Ireland who were directly impacted by clergy abuse, or my LGBTQ brothers and sisters and siblings who were made to feel unwelcome in the church over the last several decades, there are people in my life who are not very thrilled by this turn of events. It's a very, very long story, and one that I love to share, and I'm happy to share with anybody at any time, but here's the 1-minute version. I was raised Catholic, and growing up, I was like really, really Catholic. Like as soon as my parents trusted me to take out the family car, I took advantage of this privilege by driving myself to Mass every morning before high school. I went to a Jesuit university, Fairfield in Connecticut. My old friend, Father Charlie, is here somewhere. Charlie. I might have become a priest if the option was available to me. And I always knew that I wanted to work with kids. Maybe that could be your next book. And I always knew that I wanted to work with kids, and so it never occurred to me to look at any other avenues but through the church in order to work with kids. And so I decided to go to seminary, and my vague aspiration of becoming a campus minister, maybe at a Catholic high school or a Catholic college. And that's where things got a little dicey. I have no regrets going to seminary, and I met some remarkable men and women there, mostly men, and I learned an extraordinary amount, so no regrets. But I was finding it more and more difficult to reconcile the messages that the church was conveying in 1988 or so about the LGBTQ community with what I knew to be true about some of my dearest friends in the world. And then, towards the end of my time in seminary in 1991, I realized that I, too, had the capacity to love and the capacity to feel attracted to and the capacity to have a loving romantic partnership with women the way that I had had with men in high school or college or seminary. And I'll make a very long story short. I came out. I got into it, shall we say, with one professor in particular about some of the church's teachings and about this one in particular. Remember, this is 1991. And to make a long story short, he told me to my face that I was going to hell and that I could not be Catholic if I was gay. And so I left the church. I spent 25 years wandering after that. I tried to be a Buddhist. I tried on different Protestant denominations. I even tried to be atheist for a minute, but it turns out I'm a terrible atheist. And then, about a year and a half ago, my mom passed away. I was in charge of all the arrangements, which obviously had to include a Catholic funeral so that she could be buried next to my dad in a Catholic cemetery. He had passed away in 1999. And I attended Mass each day that week leading up to her funeral Mass and met with the priest on a few occasions for prayers and the like. And it just felt like coming home. Suddenly, I became aware of this yearning deep inside my core. I had a very rich life, full of joy, full of happiness, but there was this absence in my center. I was profoundly lonely spiritually. I had assumed all these years that the home, the only thing that I had ever thought of as home spiritually, was closed to me. And so I had turned my back on that relationship about 25 years ago. So this nagging feeling kept persisting, and last fall I Googled, I'm not kidding, gay, lesbian, Catholic, and Boston, thinking that I'd find a local chapter for dignity so I can commiserate with other ex-Catholics for whom the church was not an option either. But what I found was St. Cecilia's. That was the first Google result. So I came here to Mass and kind of couldn't believe my eyes. And so I met with some friends of friends who attended church here and kind of couldn't believe it. And then I kept meeting with people, and I worked my way up the food chain until I finally met with Father John last January and asked all the questions that I wanted to ask and asked for all the reassurances that I needed, and every step of the way was greeted with nothing but welcome and love and respect. And frequently, so much so that I was brought to tears. And I was assured every step of the way that I could find my way home here. So I joined St. Cecilia's in January and have started the process ever since of coming out as Catholic. So I have to tell you a really quick funny story. Reading Father Martin's book illuminated a number of things for me, provided language for a number of things for me. But one of them was a conversation I had with my mom when I left the church in 1991. Towards the end of the chapter in the book that comprises the main talk that Father Martin gives, he shares that he prays when encountering a real roadblock with another person, that he prays that he might see that person the way that God sees him or her. So I want to give you just a really quick example of that. My parents were wonderful when I came out as gay. They were traditional, conservative, Republican Catholics, but when it came to their daughter coming out to them, they had to, it changed their beliefs about what it means to be a member of the LGBTQ community. There's a huge amount of power in coming out, and my parents never stopped loving me. They were just wonderful. When I told them I was no longer Catholic, they had two very different reactions. So my father wanted to have a very academic conversation with me, and which I had, and he ultimately just sort of, resigned himself to the fact that I had left the church. When I told my mother that I was no longer Catholic, my mother's response was, "Yes, you are." And I was really taken aback. I said, no, I'm sorry, I wasn't asking for advice. I wasn't raising this as a conversation starter. I'm informing you that I'm no longer Catholic. And my mom said, no, you are. And I started getting really irritated with her, and I said, no, you're not listening to me. I'm telling you I'm not Catholic. And my mom gave me that look, that look like the conversation is now over. And she said to me that she knew me better than the Vatican did. And she told me that there was no reason why I couldn't be Catholic and gay. And I didn't listen to her at the time because of a lot of the interactions I was having with some of the institutional church back then, and so I left the church. But what I realize only now, after reading Father Martin's book, that my mom saw me the way that God sees me. My mom knew that I was created in the image of God no less than anybody else was. My mom knew that I was no less deserving of God's grace and redemption than anybody else. So I wish my mom could have been here this evening. I wish my dad could have been here this evening, but we would have been preaching to the choir anyway. And this has just been a wonderful start to a conversation that I really hope is going to be ongoing here at St. Cecilia's and in Boston and out there in the world and between the LGBTQ community and the institutional church. And I'm committed to being part of that conversation moving forward. And finally, like Father Martin closed his remarks, I just want to say, I know that there are probably any number of people here in this room, here for different reasons, but I wanted to just take an opportunity to extend some of the love that I have received here at St. Cecilia since rejoining not just this parish, but the church back in January. And to say to you, whether you're a member of St. Cecilia's or whether you're just visiting for the first time, if you were raised Catholic but believe that there's no place at the table for you, whether you are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender or queer or questioning or any of the other points of light that comprise our beautiful, messy LGBTQ plus community, that you are beautiful and you are no less created in the image of God and you are no less deserving of a place at the table. In his chapter on naming, Father Martin offers a reflection question. When you think of your sexual orientation, he writes, what word would you use? I would say that mine is joy. And my prayer for every single person in this church this evening is that you are able to say the same about your sexual orientation. So, thank you.
Maggie, thank you so much. As one member of the audience here, just thank you for what you shared. Everyone, my name's Andy Lawton. It's great to be with you this evening. I'll echo what Maggie said. Like she did, the short version of my life is that I'm originally from Wisconsin. I grew up in a big Catholic family. I attended a Catholic university. I had the opportunity to train as a physician, and I've attended St. Cecilia Parish here in Boston for the past 2 years. And again, like Maggie, I really love it here. As a member of both the LGBT community and the Catholic Church, I have for years been trying to make sense of how these fit together. Over the past few weeks, I've had the privilege of reading and reflecting on Father Martin's book. And as I've read, I've found myself writing notes, drawing arrows, circling, highlighting, trying to capture all of the excitement, the unrest, and the hope that this book gave me. I'd like to share with you a little bit of what I love about the book, what I'm wrestling with, and what I still wonder about. First, what I love. What struck me right away was that Father Martin takes this complex, controversial issue, LGBT people and the Catholic Church, and he just says it all out loud. In his graceful way, he says what a lot of us know is true. Gay people are in the church. They often don't feel welcomed. Their relationship with the church is really complex. It's messy, and we need to talk about it. You see, Father Martin, as you heard, silence on this issue is not acceptable. Actually, being silent about this perpetuates a sort of complacency and avoidance that is inconsistent with our church's emphasis on social justice. He reminds us that, you heard him, like everyone in our church community, LGBT people need to hear their name said out loud. Because when we actually hear our name and the words we identify with, we start to feel included and empowered within our community of faith. This was true for me here at St. Cecilia last Sunday, when Father John called out what a beautiful weekend it was here in our city, identifying the Boston Pride celebration in particular. With such a simple comment, I thought, wow, he knows we are here. He just said it. And as a gay person, you couldn't help but feel seen and loved. But even more than this idea of avoiding silence and naming the presence of LGBT Catholics, here's what I love most about the book. Father Martin's entire framework for this complex issue is positive. The relationship between LGBT people and the Catholic Church is presented not really as a problem, but as an opportunity. The book invites us to consider, what if the Church wasn't just accepting or welcoming of LGBT people? What if the Church was actually a model for the rest of the world? Can we imagine that? In these times, he says the Church should be a sign of unity. Now that rocked my world a little bit. The Church, in her wisdom, has been a model, a pioneer of social justice for many marginalized groups of people. You heard Father Martin talk about it: refugees, the poor, the sick. Now, what if we took the opportunity to do the same for our LGBT brothers and sisters? There's no doubt that reconciling the LGBT community and the Catholic Church is a very complex task. But if we start to see this not as a problem, but as an opportunity to talk, to know each other better, then suddenly for me there starts to blossom an incredible amount of hope. Okay, here's the part I'm struggling with. Father Martin rightly points out that this is a two-way bridge, and that LGBT people have to put forth the same respect, compassion, and sensitivity towards the Church that they expect in return. I completely agree. But what we also have to remember is that at times it will be hard for LGBT Catholics to fully engage in a dialogue that they may feel involves a certain denial of self. Many of us who are gay have gone through a coming out process and have moved from a place of self-doubt and even shame to a place of self-acceptance and self-love. And so when you're asked to dialogue sometimes with others who don't agree with the way you express love in the world, it can start to feel like you're being pulled back into this place of self-doubt and unacceptance that you really don't want to go back to. A few weeks ago, I was talking with a close college friend of mine about this issue and about the upcoming release of Father Martin's book. She is very Catholic, what I would call a traditionalist, and we love each other very much. But there were parts of our calm, respectful conversation that felt almost intolerable to me. Having someone question the goodness of the way that I love, a love which God created, felt like this rather unhealthy energy that part of me wanted to move away from. As we enter into this dialogue, we have to be sensitive to the process that many LGBT people have gone through to arrive at this place of self-acceptance. I think Building a Bridge does recognize this. The book repeatedly calls us to approach the other with a spirit of sensitivity and humility. A bishop can't fully appreciate what it's like for a transgender person to navigate through the world. And the transgender person probably can't fully appreciate the many burdens that the bishop faces as he tries to lift up his struggling diocese. But again, what's being asked of LGBT people here may be uniquely different. Being challenged on the way you express and experience love can feel especially difficult because it overlaps with who you are as a person. This dynamic will require from everyone the deepest level of sensitivity. And yet we have to talk. We have to get to know one another and give each other, as Father Martin suggests, the gifts of patience and time. Lastly, here's what I'm wondering about. Building a Bridge invites the LGBT community and the Catholic Church to offer each other these beautiful virtues right from the Catechism: respect, compassion, and sensitivity. So I can't help but wonder, once we have achieved these three virtues, what will come next in this relationship? What would it be like for the LGBT community and the Catholic Church to celebrate one another or encourage one another? Celebration and encouragement are traits that come to mind. In a 2015 documentary on the subject of LGBT Catholics called Owning Our Faith, Mike is a high school teacher, a faithful Catholic, and an elderly gay man. Sharing his story, Mike says at one point, "It's not just a matter of accepting us or tolerating us. You have to encourage us to be who we are. We are God's creation. And we may not fit into some box of traditional human relationships, but our energy is real. Our reality is real." As a gay guy myself and as a Catholic, I have so much hope for our church, and also a good deal of heartache. I love this church so much, and yet there are still times when our relationship feels unsettled, unfinished. Somehow, in just 150 pages, Father Martin gives voice to all of that. The book doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but rather invites us into an open and loving conversation. We have the opportunity to know each other better, and for that, I feel so hopeful and so excited. Father Martin, thank you for giving us the gift of this book and this conversation. And if there's room on that bridge for one more person, please count me in.
I'm very moved by those comments. I want to thank Andy and Maggie for being so honest. And, one of the reasons I said, thank you. One of the reasons I said that I don't know all the answers is because I do not know all the answers. And you can see what great gifts the Holy Spirit gives us in our church and how important it is to listen to all voices. So I want to just respond very briefly and then take some of your questions. So, Maggie, first of all, thank you for pointing out what I know after the book came out as a lacuna in the book, which is a relative absence of women and women's experiences. And, I think if I wrote the book again today, it would be a lot different. I'd put in a lot of my lesbian friends' experiences and things like that. And, we write books with blinders on frequently. And it wasn't until it came out that someone said, there aren't a lot of women. And I thought, oh. So that's an apology. So you're right. Other than talking about lesbians and LGBT, it's mostly a male-centered book because I admit most of my LGBT friends are gay men. I loved your idea of coming out. That's another kind of bridge building. It's not sort of to in a sense, the institutional church. It's to people you know and coming out as Catholic. That's there are many ways of being on that bridge. So thank you for that. And it's just great how the Spirit works. When I asked that question in the book about, what name would you give your sexuality, of course I was thinking about lesbian, gay, just sort of name yourself, but you just turned it around for me, joy. It's stunning, so thank you. And I would also say your parents are with us tonight, so very much so. And Andy, thank you so much for your comments. I would say that, I'm just be honest with you, I really struggled with how to write about inviting the LGBT community to respect, sensitivity, and compassion. And even in the last iteration of the book, I put in more stuff about, I know how hard it is, and I still struggle with that, and you're listening to you. I struggle with what the correct way of doing that is, and how to sort of invite a sort of note of forgiveness to that. So I still struggle with that. I don't know the answer to that. I would say something that might surprise you, though. And I understand what you're saying about meeting people who might make you feel like you have to withdraw or sort of kind of go back to a place you don't want to be in. I have a theory. I think that about this issue and about this conversation, most LGBT adults are more knowledgeable, more mature, and more centered than many of our bishops and priests are. And so, in fact, you might be in a... Because why do I say that? Because you have like an emotionally mature adult gay male. You have thought about this for a long time in a very kind of deep way, and I sometimes think that you are actually in a stronger position. I know that sounds counterintuitive. I mean, in terms of power, hierarchical power, there's a differential. But I actually think that many of the LGBT people I know are more emotionally mature about that particular issue. And so when you're going into that dialogue, you actually might be the stronger one. So it's just something to consider. What next? When Father Pedro Rupe, the former Superior General of the Society of Jesus, was asked once, I thought about this when you asked the question, where is the Society of Jesus going, by a reporter, he said, I have no idea. And that sort of freaks people out. But I think, it's like the apostles, on Easter Sunday. They didn't know where they were going. And I think that, so I don't know. I really don't know. I think encounter, though, is the first step. So you're hearing probably for the first time in your life a Jesuit saying the words, I don't know.